Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. And this is Ahiman Rezon from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Ahiman Rezon, the title given to their Book of Constitutions by that schism from the Grand Lodge of England, which took place about the middle of the last century, and which was known as the Ancient Masons, in contradistinction to the legitimate Grand Lodge and its adherents, who were called the Moderns, and whose code of laws was contained in Anderson's work known as the Book of Constitutions. The title was derived from three Hebrew words: Ahim, brothers, manna, to appoint, or to select, in the sense of being placed in a peculiar class. See Isaiah 53:12, and Rezon, the will, pleasure, or meaning, and hence the combination of the three words in the title, Ahiman Rezon, signifies the will of selected brethren, the law of a class or society of men who are chosen or selected from the rest of the world as brethren. This is the etymology that I proposed many years ago, and I have seen no good reason since for abandoning it. Two other derivations, however, one antedate and the other subsequent to this, have been suggested. Dr. Delcold derives it from ahai, a brother, manha, to prepare, and rezon, secret, so that, as he says, Ahiman Rezon literally means the secrets of a prepared brother. But the best meaning of manha is that which conveys the idea of being placed in or appointed to a certain exclusive class, as we find in Isaiah 53:12. He was numbered with the transgressors, placed in that class, being taken out of every other order of men. Although reason may come from Rezon, a will or law, it can hardly be elicited by any rules of etymology out of the Chaldean word raz, a secret, the termination in, on being, wanting. And besides, the book called Ahiman Rezon does not contain these secrets, but only the public laws of Masonry. The derivation of Delcold seems therefore inadmissible. Not less so is that of Brother W.S. Rockwell, who thinks the derivation may be found in the Hebrew, a mun, a builder or architect, and reason as a noun, prince, and as an adjective, royal, and hence Ahiman Rezon, according to this etymology, will signify the royal builder or symbolically the Freemason, but to derive Ahiman from Amun rather than Aman, which is the Masoretic pronunciation, is to place all known laws of etymology at defiance. Rockwell himself, however, furnishes the best argument against his strained derivation when he admits that its correctness will depend on the antiquity of the phrase, which he acknowledges that he doubts. In this he is right. The phrase is altogether a modern one and has Dermot, the author of the work bearing the title, for its invention. Rockwell's conjectural derivation is, therefore, for this reason, still more inadmissible than Delcold's. But the history of the origin of the book is more important and more interesting than the history of the derivation of its title. The close of the first quarter of the 18th century found the Masons of the south of England congregated under the authority of a governing body at England, whose title was the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of England. But from causes upon which it is here unnecessary to dwell, a schism soon afterward took place, and a portion of the brethren, having seceded from the main body, organized an independent Grand Lodge. This they called the Grand Lodge of Ancient York Masons, and stigmatized the members of the original body as moderns, by way of insinuating that they themselves were of the primitive or original stock, and that their opponents were innovators of a later birth. The former of these contending bodies, the Grand Lodge of England, had, in the year 1722, caused Dr. James Anderson to collect and compile all the statutes and regulations by which the fraternity had in former times been governed, and these, after having been submitted to due revision, were published in 1723 by Anderson with the title of the Constitutions of the Freemasons. This work, of which several other editions subsequently appeared, has also been called the Book of Constitutions and contains the foundations of the written law by which the Grand Lodge of England and the lodges deriving from it, both in that country and in America, are governed. But when the Irish Masons established their rival Grand Lodge, they found it necessary also to have a book of constitutions, and accordingly, Lawrence Dermott, who was at one time their Grand Secretary and afterward their Deputy Grand Master, compiled such a work, the first edition of which was published by James Bedford at London in 1756, with the following title, Ahiman Rezon, or A Help to a Brother, showing the excellency of secrecy and the first cause or motion of the institution of Masonry, the principles of the craft, and the benefits from a strict observation thereof, etc., etc. Also the old and new regulations, etc., to which is added the greatest collection of Mason's songs, etc., by Brother Lawrence Dermott, Secretary. A second edition in 1764 with this title, Ahiman Rezon, or A Help to All That Are or Would Be Free and Accepted Masons, containing the quintessence of all that has been published on the subject of Freemasonry with many additions, which renders this work more useful than any other book of constitution now extant, by Dermott, Secretary, London, 1764. A third edition was published in 1778 with the following title, Ahiman Rezon, or A Help to All That Are or Would Be Free and Accepted Masons, with many additions, by Dermott D.G.M., printed for James John, Grand Secretary, and sold by Peter Shotwell, in the Strad, London, 1778. 5 other editions were published, the 4th in 1778, the 5th in 1787, the 6th in 1800, the 7th in 1801, the 8th in 1807, the 9th in 1813. And this year, the ancient Grand Lodge was dissolved by the union of the 2 Grand Lodges of England, and a new book of constitutions having been adopted for the united body, the Ahiman Rezon became useless, and no subsequent edition was ever published. The earlier editions of this work are among the rarest of Masonic publications and are highly prized by collectors. In the year 1855, Mr. Leon Heinemann of Philadelphia, who was engaged in a reprint of old standard Masonic works, an enterprise which should have received better patronage than it did, republished the second edition with a few explanatory notes, as this book contains those principles of Masonic law by which, for 3/4 of a century, a large and intelligent portion of the craft was governed, and as it is now becoming rare and, to the generality of readers, inaccessible, some brief review of its contents may not be uninteresting. The preface or address to the reader, which is a long one, contains what purports to be a history of Masonry, whose origin under that name Dermott places at the building of Solomon's Temple. This history, which after all is not worth much, includes some very cautious remarks on the revivers of Freemasonry in 1717, whose Grand Lodge he calls a self-created assembly. There is next a phylacteria for such gentlemen as may be inclined to become Freemasons. This article, which was not in the first edition, but appeared for the first time in the second, consists of directions as to the method to be pursued by one who desires to be a Freemason. This is followed by an account of what Dermott calls modern Masonry. This is the system presumed by the original Grand Lodge of England and of the differences existing between it and ancient Masonry, or the system of his own Grand Lodge. He contends that there are material differences between the two systems, that of the ancients being universal and that of the moderns not. A modern being able with safety to communicate all his secrets to an ancient, while an ancient cannot communicate his to a modern having no right to be called free and accepted, all of which, in his opinion, show that the ancients have secrets which are not in the possession of the moderns. This, he considers, a convincing proof that the modern Masons were innovators upon the established system and had instituted their lodges and framed their ritual without sufficient knowledge of the arcana of the craft. But the modern Masons, with more semblance of truth, thought that the additional secrets of the ancients were only innovations that they had made upon the true body of Masonry, and hence they considered their ignorance of these newly invented secrets was the best evidence of their own superior antiquity. And the latest editions, Dermot had published the famous Leland manuscript, together with the commentaries of Locke. Also the resolutions adopted in 1772, by which the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland agreed to maintain a brotherly connection and correspondence with the Grand Lodge of England, or Ancients. The Ahiman Rezon proper then begins with 23 pages of an encomium on Masonry, and an explanation of its principles. Many a modern Masonic addresses is better written, and contains more important and instructive matter than this preparatory discourse. On the 27th page we find the old charges of the free and accepted Masons. These charges were first printed in Anderson's Constitutions in 1723 and have always been considered of the highest value as Masonic law. Dermot's charges are interpolated and much altered, being a copy of those in Anderson's 1738 edition, and are therefore deemed of no authority. 50 pages are next occupied with the general regulations of the free and accepted Masons. These are borrowed from the second edition of Anderson, which edition has never been in great repute, but even here, Dermot's alterations and innovations are so considerable as to render this part of his work entirely untrustworthy as an exponent of Masonic law. The rest of the book comprises more than 100 pages, consists of a collection of Mason songs, of the poetical merits of which the least said, the better for the literary reputation of the writers. Imperfectly, however, as was this work, it for a long time constituted the statute book of the ancient Masons, and hence these lodges in America, which derive their authority from the Dermot or Ancient Grand Lodge of England, accepted its contents as a true exposition of Masonic law, and several of their Grand Lodges caused similar works to be compiled for their own government, adopting the title of Ahiman Rezon, which thus became the peculiar designation of the volume which contained the fundamental law of the ancients, while the original title of Book of Constitutions continued to be retained by the moderns to designate the volume used by them for the same purpose. Of the Ahiman Rezons compiled and published in America, the following are the principal. 1. Ahiman Rezon, abridged and digested, as a help to all that are or would be free and accepted Masons, etc., published by order of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, by William Smith, D.D., Philadelphia, 1783. A new Ahiman Rezon was published by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania in 1825. 2. Charges and Regulations of the Ancient and Honorable Society of Free and Accepted Masons, extracted from the Ahiman Rezon, etc., published by the Council and Direction of the Grand Lodge of Nova Scotia, Halifax, 1786. 3. The New Ahiman Rezon, containing the laws and Constitution of Virginia, etc., by John K. Reedy, present Deputy Grand Master of Virginia, etc., Richmond, 1791. Another edition was published in 1818 by James Henderson. 4. The Maryland Ahiman Rezon of Free and Accepted Masons, containing the history of Masonry from the establishment of the Grand Lodge to the present time, with their ancient charges, addresses, prayers, lectures, prologues, epilogues, songs, etc. collected from the old records, Faithful Traditions and Lodge Book by G. Keating, compiled by order of the Grand Lodge of Maryland, Baltimore, 1797. 5. The Ahiman Rezon and Masonic Ritual, published by the order of the Grand Lodge of North Carolina and Tennessee, Newborn, North Carolina, 1805. 6. An Ahiman Rezon for the use of the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, Ancient York Masons, and the lodges under the register and Masonic jurisdiction thereof, compiled and arranged with considerable additions at the request of the Grand Lodge, and published by their authority, by Brother Franklin Delcold, M.D., etc. Charleston, South Carolina, 1807. A second edition was published by the same author in 1822, and a third in 1852 by Dr. Albert G. Mackey. In this third edition, the title was changed to that of the Ahiman Rezon, or Book of Constitutions, etc., and the work was in a great measure expurgated of the peculiarities of Dermont and made to conform more closely to the Anderson and Constitutions. A fourth edition was published by the same editor in 1871, in which everything antagonistic to the original Book of Constitutions has been omitted. 7. The Freemasons' Liberty and General Ahiman Rezon, containing a delineation of the true principles of Freemasonry, etc., by Samuel Cole, Baltimore, 1817. There was a second edition in 1826. 8. Ahiman Rezon, prepared under the direction of the Grand Lodge of Georgia by Worshipful Master S. Rockwell, Grand Master of Masons of Georgia, Savannah, 1859. But neither this work nor the third and fourth editions of the Ahiman Rezon of South Carolina have any connection in principle or theory with the Ahiman Rezon of Dermont. They have borrowed the name from the ancient Masons, but they derive all their laws and their authorities from the moderns, or the legal Masons of the last century. 9. The General Ahiman Rezon and Freemasons Guide by Daniel Sickles, New York, 1866. This book, like Rockwell's, has no other connection with the archetypal work of Dermont, but the name. Many of the Grand Lodges of the United States have derived their existence and authority from Dermont's Grand Lodge. The influence of his Ahiman Rezon was for a long time exercised over the lodges of this country, and indeed, it is only within a comparatively recent period that the true principles of Masonic law, as expounded in the first editions of Anderson's Constitutions, have been universally adopted among American Masons. It must, however, be observed in justice to Dermont, who has been rather too grossly abused by Mitchell and a few other writers, that the innovations upon the old laws of Masonry, which are to be found in the Ahiman Rezon, are for the most part not to be charged upon him, but upon Dr. Anderson himself, who, for the first time, introduced them into the second edition of the Book of Constitutions, published in 1738. It is surprising and accountable only on the ground of sheer carelessness on the part of the supervising committee that the Grand Lodge should, in 1738, have approved of these alterations made by Anderson, and still more surprising that it was not until 1756 that a new and third edition of the Constitutions should have been published, in which these alterations of 1738 were expunged, and the old regulations and the old language restored. But whatever may have been the causes of this oversight, it is not to be doubted that, at the time of the formation of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, the edition of the Book of Constitutions of 1738 was considered as the authorized exponent of Masonic law by the original or regular Grand Lodge of England, and was adopted with but little change by Dermont as the basis of his Ahiman Rezon. How much this edition of 1738 differed from that of 1723, which is now considered the only true authority for ancient law, and how much it agreed with Dermont's Ahiman Rezon, will be evident from the following specimens of the first of the old charges, correctly taken from each of the three works. First of the old charges in the Book of Constitutions, edition 1723. A Mason is obligated by his tincture to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he will never be a stupid atheist, nor an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet it is now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their peculiar opinions to themselves, that is to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty, by whatever denominations or persuasions they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendships among persons that must have remained at a perpetual distance. First of the old charges in the Book of Constitutions, edition 1738. A Mason is obligated by his tincture to observe the moral law as a true noekada, and if he rightly understands the craft, he will never be a stupid atheist, nor a religious libertine, nor act against conscience. In ancient times, the Christian Masons were charged to comply with the Christian usages of each country where they traveled or worked. But Masonry being founded in all nations, even of diverse religions, they are now only charged to adhere to that religion in which all men agree, leaving each brother to his own peculiar opinions, that is, to be good men and true, men of honor and honesty, by whatever names, religions, or persuasions they may be distinguished, for they all agree in the 3 great articles of Noah, enough to preserve the cement of the lodge. Thus, Masonry is the center of their union and the happy means of conciliating persons that otherwise must have remained at a perpetual distance. First of the old charges in Dermot's Ahiman Rezon. A Mason is obliged by his tincture to observe the moral law as a true noekada, and if he rightly understands the craft, he will never be a stupid atheist nor an irreligious libertine, nor act against conscience. In ancient times, the Christian Masons were charged to comply with the Christian usages of each country where they traveled or worked, being found in all nations, even of diverse religions. They are generally charged to adhere to that religion in which all men agree, leaving each brother to his own peculiar opinions, that is, to be good men and true, men of honor and honesty, by whatever names, religions, or persuasions they may be distinguished, for they all agree in the 3 great articles of Noah, enough to preserve the cement of the lodge. Thus, Masonry is the center of their union and the happy means of conciliating persons that otherwise must have remained at a perpetual distance. The italices in the 2nd and 3rd extracts will show the innovations Anderson made in 1738 on the charges as originally published in 1723, and how closely Dermot followed him in adopting these innovations. There is, in fact, much less difference between Ahiman Rezon of Dermot and Anderson's edition of the Book of Constitutions, printed in 1738, than there is between the latter and the first edition of the Constitutions, printed in 1723. But the great points of difference between the ancients and the moderns, points which keep them apart for so many years, are to be found in their work and ritual, for an account of which the reader is referred to the article Ancient Masons. ELH. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.